Welcome once again, this January 14th, 2003, to another Talking Together program in the Winter Series 2000-2003. The quartet of four that you will see before you includes Walter Powers to my right, Mary Jane Gibson to his right, and Richard Sentner to her right. We understand that Bill Moyers hosted Howard Zinn on TV Friday evening, January 10th. We've decided that such exchanges take place not only on that television, but on in other areas as well. And so today, we are going to share points of view about whether we should have a war or should not have a war. And we're going to borrow from Howard Zinn to provide some history and some facts. We believe in the sanctity of humanity. Abundance of information exists whereby to negotiate rather than to explode through military confrontation. We are a great nation for being sports-centered. But the truth of the matter is that human lives do not come in teams where we win, they lose. Children as young as 7 years old who have been interviewed by journalists have told them, war is no good. There are no winners. Everyone suffers. Killing militarily cannot produce the constructive connections nature has made possible for us. The capability of discourse, reason, logic, understanding. Leaders in government rarely endure the atrocities of the multitude of innocent civilians, women, children, other folk, none of whom are responsible for government's decision-making. Leaders tend to move on their own. Having been born in a country that a nation might hate, another nation might hate, is enough excuse for some countries to go to war. Those people somehow don't exist. War must be stopped. Ending segregation trained some people to take to the streets. Demanding the right to vote enlisted warriors. Ideologies, however, cannot stop wars. Only human beings can accomplish that goal. We understand human behavior may be shot through with unconscious motives. But why are we not creating a body of principles, consciously motivating the principle, do not kill? We need a new world, but that can evolve only if we rearrange societal values to acknowledge all human lives as having the birthrights to share all the other human rights. And so we are initiating this program with an excerpt from the Village Voice that was printed December 25th, 31st, in which an interview took place with Howard Zinn. The article is entitled Peace Trainer. And I quote from that article, "The retired Boston University political science professor speaks out against war. He argues with the force of experience and history. Everywhere he looks these days, he sees possibilities for a strong popular movement against an invasion of Iraq. He sees hope in the college and high school students he speaks to, some of whom have read his best-selling revisionist history, A People's History of the United States, published first in 1980. And the numerous rallies and protests that are popping up in small towns from Montana to Alaska, not counting the larger events in cities like New York and Washington. These give him heart. Zinn also looks at the polls, which show that as soon as questions of casualties or an extended campaign are raised, most of the country is opposed to war in Iraq. Quote from Howard, "There are large numbers of Americans whose support for war is easily punctured by facts, by new information." And so the four of us are hoping we can provide you with some facts and some information perhaps you haven't been able to attain.
I like the results of that poll, Ethel. Looking at the Cape Cod Times the other day, Bush retains powerful image. It seems that, but my question is, where is he leading us? And are we given a thoughtful, cogent rationale for his direction? And then again, another headline, Bush rallies nervous troops. President says war will be the last resort, but bolsters his case for combat against Iraq. And briefly, he says Iraq is a great threat to the United States, and Saddam Hussein has publicly proclaimed his hatred for our country. Saddam has used weapons of mass destruction, has defied UN resolutions that he disarmed, and most recently did not even attempt a credible declaration to the United Nations on his alleged stockpiles of weapons and his program to develop more. And we'll be talking about the 12,000 pages of documents that Iraq did submit. He concludes, "If force becomes necessary to secure our country and to keep the peace, America will act deliberately, America will act decisively, and America will prevail because we got the finest military in the world," Bush said. And to complement that, here comes Rumsfeld when he says, "We can fight on two fronts, could face two wars, Iraq and Korea." We'll come back to the 12,000 pages and just how well or not well Iraq is cooperating. But in the meantime,
Actually, Walter, I'd like to take a contrary view to something that Ethel read when it said that everybody suffers in a war. And I think looking at it over the long term, that's probably true. But one of the things that makes the proposed war insidious is that we are removed from the suffering. We don't have a draft, so only the volunteer army goes. No one at this table knows anyone who will go to Iraq. Is that true?
yeah.
We're not related. We don't have a nephew or a grandson who will go. The Bush administration has failed to ask Americans to sacrifice in any way. We don't have to conserve gas or ration butter as we did 50 years ago. They have a cavalier attitude toward deficits and don't mind piling up deficits for our children and grandchildren to pay, hiding the costs of war and postponing it to the future. So one of my resentments about this war is that we are, in a sense, getting it on the cheap, that we are not paying now and that we are not suffering and our own children are not going. And I think that's part of a deliberate plan to keep us from sharing the sacrifice. And therefore, the pain comes later. And I think that that's one of the, maybe it's a necessary consequence of contemporary military wars, but it's not, it keeps the middle class from being personally involved and engaged and dreading it, except on an intellectual level. But I do want to make one positive point. Having brought you down with that, I was very heartened to read that the Guardian, which I think was the Manchester Guardian, wasn't it? Is that a new, do they just call it the Guardian now? Said recently, the tide after all appears to have turned. What limited enthusiasm there was for invading Iraq ebbs slowly away in today's papers. That, in any case, is a hope.
Well, I actually think it's, the poll numbers, I think, are a little misleading. I mean, the United States is the only country in the world where the population, according to polls, is actually in favor of the war. And this is a result of a very concentrated campaign of fear. And this is something that the policymakers in this country have become very adroit at over the years. When I can remember back in the 50s, my own father was building like a fallout shelter in the basement, you know, and you go to school and they'd show you how you could huddle under the desk in case the Russians were going to, you know, drop the bomb or something. And this is something that's been going on for a very long time. And that's the real difference between this country and, say, Iraq's neighbors. I mean, Iraq's neighbors hate Saddam, but they're not afraid of him. The only people in the world that are afraid of him are the American people. The American people are probably the most terrified population on the face of the earth. You go back to the 80s, the tourism in Europe practically collapsed because Americans were afraid to travel to Europe because of the hijackings that have been taking place, you know. The whole business about crime is another example of where Americans are just terrified of crime, despite the fact that the crime statistics have been going down for years. And this isn't being done by any accident. It's the result of a very concentrated campaign. You might remember back in the 80s, there were supposed to be Libyan hit teams roaming Washington trying to, you know, knock off our president. Grenada was supposed to be a launching pad for the Soviets to invade us, and we actually lived in a state of emergency from the country of Nicaragua. You know, Nicaragua was this great threat to our national security. So this is a very concentrated effort that's been going on, and I mean, I do think, as I said before, that the support for the administration is very, very thin, but it is based on fear.
Richard, what has Iraq done to us that has earned for them this hatred?
Well, for one thing, they have oil that we want to get our hands on. That's certainly a major part of it. And I think I've discussed before the rotten apple theory, which I also think sort of plays into this, the fact that you have somebody who's sort of thumbing his nose at us. And if we let him get away with that, then who knows, maybe the guys across the border might get the same idea.
What about North Korea?
North Korea doesn't have oil, and they also are a completely isolated a country that you know, if there were some sort of a war there, an awful lot of people would end up getting killed. There's no question about it. But what North Korea does is expose the fraudulence of this coming war with Iraq.
That's the point.
That's what it does, absolutely. There's no question about it. I mean, from the standpoint of weapons of mass destruction, North Korea is a much greater threat than Iraq.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I guess my difficulty is trying to reconcile some sense, but I can't.
Well, I personally think you have to put this into this kind of an overall context of American foreign policy, because there's like this sort of world system that we're trying to sort of resurrect, you know, and it involves an awful lot of countries. I mean, what 9/11 produced more than anything else was an opportunity for countries to unleash terror against their own populations, you know. I mean, this is true whether you want to talk about Russia or China or any of these other countries, you know, that are supposed to be our allies. Turkey is probably one of the worst examples. In the 1990s, when we were screaming about what was happening in the Balkans, we had to go to war because we couldn't allow any ethnic cleansing to take place on the borders of NATO. But the worst ethnic cleansing was taking place within NATO, inside Turkey. The United States military aid, once you put Israel and Egypt off to the side, they're almost like a special case. Once you put them off to the side, Turkey was getting more military aid than any country in the world. They were getting something like a double what the Cold War levels had been, and it's because there was a Kurdish insurrection that was taking place inside Turkey. And from about 1984 to 1997, the worst slaughter in the world was actually taking place inside Turkey, thanks to American arms. That eventually, the level of military aid to Turkey began to go down again, mainly because the attempts to put down the insurrection were successful. And at that point, the largest military aid, again, outside of Israel and Egypt, went to Colombia. And in fact, you can chart wherever you have a country that has the worst human rights records, that's the country that's going to get the most military aid. Because it's almost always the result of an insurrection and a counter-insurrection. So I really think all of this has to sort of be put into a sort of a proper context. It's very obvious that the people inside the administration view Iraq as a pushover. It's just going to be no problem to take care of them. Iran is next. And in fact, the war in Iran may have already begun. Turns out that about 12% of Israel's air force is in southeast Turkey on the Iranian border, and they've been running reconnaissance missions into Iran. And people inside, the more hawkish elements inside the Bush administration, really see the scenario of actually breaking up Iran into different sections, to sort of cordon it off from the other oil producers. You know, and that's why I mentioned in one of our earlier talks the fact that when you're talking about Iraq, you aren't just talking about Iraq, but you're talking about a lot of other stuff that's going to come. Because if they are successful in taking out Iraq, then we have no way of knowing, you know, where this is going to end. But it's very clear that Iran is like the next country on their list.
Well, stop war is more than just a slogan now.
Well, I would just like to make a comment with respect to that. The only way that's going to happen is if there is really a major movement to stop this war. I mean, and in fact, it looks as though we're not going to be able to stop the war from beginning. But what we have now is the greatest anti-war movement that's ever been put together before a war has begun. You know, the Gulf War was the first example of an anti-war movement being developed before a war began, but it wasn't much of a movement. But today, it's a really major movement. And the real task, if this war starts, is going to raise the cost of the war at such a level that we can shorten the war. And how we'll know whether that's being successful or not is when the repression starts. Because whenever there's an anti-war movement that becomes successful, then the state moves to very repressive measures. And so that's how you'll know, when the state becomes very repressive in its dealings with the anti-war movement, that's when you'll know that the anti-war movement is actually having an effect.
You know that quotation that I used, war is no good, there are no winners, everyone suffers? That came from a book that was published, Children in War, by the Raymonds. And they did a documentary for HBO and received the award for it. These two persons, a couple, went to Ireland, Rwanda. They talked with Palestinian children and Israeli children. And they were mortified that these young children, and some of them were 6, 7 years old, not adolescents, young children, could make that statement to them. Mm-hmm. And I think we have become, I shouldn't say we, there is a tendency, as long as we're not really in it, our children won't be there, but other people's children will be there. And I think it's high time that we recognized that we are part of a process that is destroying humanity and the environment. And one step to take is a first step: stop war.
So, attack Iraq. Well, the missing debate on peace, justice, and security. We need this debate. It's an issue we can afford not to talk about. The public press says that Saddam Hussein is hiding things, that he hasn't submitted enough documents. What of these 12,000 pages of documents? Our government says we won't talk about them until we've had a a reasonable time to digest the material. But we'll talk about most such news management is entirely voluntarily. And this is in the Nation magazine, January 13th and the 20th, very, very new. The Berlin Daily Tageszeitung got a world-class scoop just before Christmas by getting hold of Iraq's 12,000-page document concerning its relationship with weapons of mass destruction. The United Nations obeyed the United States' demand that it censor the report before it was given to members of the Security Council. And by the way, only a few countries have been given the original documents. Swiftly excised, taken out, were the corporations, mostly United States, British, and German, that supplied Iraq with nuclear, chemical, biological, and missile technology prior to 1991. Our government gave them these things. Such shipments, encouraged by the relevant governments, were illegal under the terms of solemn international treaties and laws. U.S. corporations included Honeywell, Spectra Physics, Rockwell, Hewlett-Packard, DuPont, Eastman Kodak, Bechtel, and others, 24 in all. In addition, the United States Departments of Defense, Energy, Commerce, and Agriculture were designated as suppliers. A big story? Well, you might think so. The European Press covered it. Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Covered it. We can get her on WOMR on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays at 4 o'clock. And the interviewer, Alexander Cockburn, he said, I heard a good interview on CBS Radio with the journalist who got the scoop. The London Independent ran a story on December 18th, but the U.S. corporate press, nothing that I can find. Have you heard of these before?
No.
Oh.
I just wanted to bring today a website for people, for our viewers who may be computer literate and who use the web for their information. There's something called moveon.org, which will tell you where anti-war demonstrations are being held throughout the country. It doesn't take responsibility for informing you about the style of the demonstration or the tone of the demonstration, which they can't do. But if you're interested, it's moveon.org, and it lists the anti-war demonstrations, which, as Richard mentioned, are multiplying across the country. And readers who are not computer literate could call me. And I will tell you where these are going to be held. I don't know that the Cape has been listed in this, but I know that there eventually will be, and our local press will cover it. But one of the features of knowing this is to get a sense of the small towns across the country where real demonstrations are being held weekly. And of course there will be a very large demonstration in Washington next week, next Saturday, the 18th. And those who would like to participate in what will be a giant demonstration, I think, should go to Washington.
There was an interesting letter to the Times touching upon the questions we've been thinking about. And this was a letter from a person in Herndon, Virginia. Representative Charles B. Rangel's proposition that a military draft be reinstated is misguided and frightening. His suggestion that our drafted sons and daughters would bring a greater appreciation of the consequences of decisions to go to war raises cynicism to a new level. A draft of our youth to fight in a war that many have questioned is morally reprehensible. And we still have not been offered any solid evidence that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
I disagree, because I think that the mere mention of a draft has people's stomachs churning. You can talk about war in the abstract, but when your nephew, your grandson, your children are vulnerable, you feel it differently, somewhat closer, I expect, to the Iraqi mothers and what they must be feeling now. And I don't think that, I think that's a practical matter, and it could be called universal service, and young people could go to a sort of local Peace Corps and work in Appalachia and work in the inner city for 2 years. But to have a universality of service, I think is absolutely key, and I think Charlie Rangel is doing us all a favor. I disagree. I think he's doing us a favor to raise the possibility that all of us will be immediately involved. As it is, as I said earlier, I think they offer the prospect of war on the cheap. We don't have to give up anything, keep your SUVs, keep driving gas guzzlers. Who cares? We're going to secure oil to protect our indulgence. It's not to protect that we have cars. It's to protect the indulgent use of gas guzzlers. But the Bush administration has presumably made a decision not to ask any sacrifice that's visible now of middle-class Americans. And I think that that's what's cynical. I think to enable us not to pay for it now, not to be involved in it personally, not to have to give up anything, to have it in the abstract and at arm's length and in the papers, is having it on the cheap, and that's what's cynical.
And that's, in fact, what Charlie Rangel was after.
Absolutely.
It's not that Charlie Rangel was interested really in bringing the draft back.
No.
He's simply trying to point out the inequities involved in the system that we have now. And actually, I never thought it was a good idea to end the draft. For one thing, it's a good vehicle for the anti-war movement to attack the war machine. If you have a draft, it's one way to do it, you know. And so what they've done is the volunteer army is essentially a class system, you know.
Absolutely.
I mean, people, you know, who live in Wellesley Hills, you know, their kids are not going to be involved in the volunteer army. You know, I mean, it's the poor that are going to be involved in the volunteer army. I mean, for the most part. And even though the draft was done along the same lines, the draft itself, you know, the previous draft was during the Vietnam War was very much of a class-based system. It didn't have to be that way. You know, you could eliminate, you know, college deferments and things of that sort, and it could be done on an equal basis. But I mean, I agree with everything that you've said about that. I mean, and I know that Charlie Rangel was not interested in bringing the draft back, but he was very upset with the fact that it's the poor that once again are going to be waging this war.
There is a radio program, which I'm sorry I can't refer people to because I don't remember it, but it allows people who are involved in anti-war work to share what their ideas are. And there's some very simple, in Eastham, just at the traffic circle last week, somebody had put a very simple homemade sign that said, well, there's been a series, so several weeks ago it said, "Whom would Jesus bomb?" Which is a kind of a shocking and maybe could be inappropriate, I'm sure, to some people, but it does make you think in a new way. And this week the question was, is war inevitable? And I wanted to get a pillowcase and put no, but I didn't do it. But people are taking the simplest things and making those suggestions. But what I'm very much interested in this point that Charlie Rangel raises, because I feel as though we are half of us. I don't know what the proportions are. Great many of us, probably 40%, resist the war, however actively, and then a great many people are rather disengaged from it because we aren't being called to participate in a way that grabs us and that makes us aware of it. I know in my own self, and I've been opposed to this war from the beginning, I was also opposed to the Gulf War, one of 3 people, I think. But I'm aware that when Rangel made the suggestion, I quickly, in my mind, went through all the people I knew who might be subject to the draft. You just run through it in your head. Do you have nephews? Do you have children? Do you have neighbors? And I know, because I know it, I saw it in myself. It suddenly says, who will have to go? And that's different from reading about it and theorizing about it. And I think we need to feel it more personally.
It's also important to understand that there's another role of this coming war, and that is to get people concentrated on something other than what the government is actually doing to them. Because once again, we're replaying what took place back in the Reagan years when there was this enormous transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, and they're doing it all over again.
Right.
And they don't want the public's attention focused on that. They want it focused, as they say, on this. They want them terrified, that Saddam is coming after them, weapons of mass destruction and all the rest of it. And that is one of the roles of the war. For one thing, the build-up to the war was obviously aimed at the congressional elections, and it was very, very successful. And the coming war itself is, in my view, and the view of others, aimed at the presidential election. And they want this war over with before the presidential election comes along, So you want the public's attention focused elsewhere so they don't realize what's actually being done to them. And I think one of the real problems that we have in this country is that there is this sort of, what you might call a sort of lower expectation umbrella, where the American public has come to expect so much less from their society and from their government that they've been willing to accept a sort of lesser lot in life. And this is being ratcheted down even further. And there are a lot of vehicles, to accomplish this, but at the moment, one of the main ones is to keep them in a constant state of fear, where that's where their concentration is on. And they're not paying attention to the fact that, once again, it's an exercise of the fact that this is essentially a welfare state for the rich. And we're going to make it even more so. And that's a major part of what's going on now.
I agree.
You were talking about having a debate, and it reminds me, as I said before, in a speech by Patrick Henry, the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, he said, and in proportion to the magnitude of the topic ought to be the freedom of the debate. It's a very, very important topic. We should have a wide sense of debate. Talking about the draft, civic responsibility, leadership responsibility. I was really taken by this. Bush sticks to his word on smallpox shot. We all got our smallpox shots years ago. It didn't make the headlines, but nevertheless, Bush said that the vaccine would be mandatory for those forces in high-risk parts of the world. Quote, as Commander-in-Chief, I do not believe I can ask others to accept this risk unless I am willing to do so, he said at the White House on December 13. I wouldn't ask people to risk if I couldn't do it. Well, let's just see a little bit about his war record. This is taken from a recent issue of Mother Jones, a little section called We Were Soldiers Once, the Bush War Record. He's quoted on the topic of sacrifice. He says, quote, I've been to war, I've raised twins. If I had a choice, I'd rather go to war. That's from the Houston Chronicle, January of last year. Well, in February of 1968, and please join in if you'd like, Bush takes an Air Force officer's test. He scores in the 25th percentile in the pilot aptitude portion, declares that he does not wish to serve overseas. Wish I had had that choice. May 27th, 1968, Bush enlists in Texas Air National Guard. Aided by Texas House Speaker Ben Barnes, he jumps over the waiting list. He pledges 2 years of active duty and 4 years of reserve service. And this was the particular National Guard in Texas that had friends of politicians and several of the Dallas Cowboy football players. Bush on why the Air National Guard took him. He said, "They could sense I would be one of the great pilots of all time," unquote. The Houston Chronicle, August 1988. Let's go to 1968. After basic training, Bush pulls in active duty to act as a gopher on Florida Senator Edward J. Gurney's campaign. And then in November of 1968, after Gurney wins, Bush is reactivated and transferred to Georgia. November 1969, Bush is flown to the White House by President Nixon for a date with daughter Tricia. Now he says when he takes the oath, the Air National Guard pledge in 1968, and Vietnam was going on, "I, George W. Bush, upon the successful completion of pilot training, plan to return to my unit and fulfill my obligation." He did not serve on active duty. And moreover, although it wasn't mentioned during the presidential campaign, but shortly after, there is over a year of his military service which is unaccounted for. Nobody knew where he was. And I'll tell you, friends, we're not going to have that kind of individual going to Iraq.
Well, there's a word for that. It's called chicken hawk. I can't remember who actually came up with the term, but the Nation magazine actually ran a whole cover story on it. And it's basically people who never served in war being the most enthusiastic supporters of sending young kids to war. But I would like to return to the matter of the smallpox incident you mentioned, because this is, I think, another example of warmongering and of trying to fill the American public with as much fear, as possible. That's really what it's about. Before we launched our war in Afghanistan, there was always talk about torture, about whether we should use torture, whether they shouldn't use torture, and suddenly the subject disappeared, and no reporter asked the question about whether torture is being used or not. Yet every time they capture some member of Al Qaeda, and he's spilling his guts, and no reporter bothers to ask whether or not they're torturing him for it. So I mean, you just can imagine if you're a prisoner, you know what they want to hear, and you give them what they want to hear, even if you have to sort of make it up. And so what they're doing is they're throwing this stuff out. All these examples of the fact that there's supposed to be a bomb being set off here, or there's going to be an Al Qaeda attack there, and it all turns out to not, because the real point isn't whether or not there's anything to these scares. The point is to keep the American people full of as much fear as you possibly can, to distract them from what's being done to them, and also to sort of rep up the level of the war. And the smallpox thing is a perfect example of that.
All of us were inoculated against smallpox, weren't we?
Oh, yes.
That was involuntary. I just think we can't miss how outrageous it is for him to call that a sacrifice, comparable to the sacrifice of these young people. The news has been full lately of these young families torn apart to go to live in the desert, to wait for a war, and for him to compare his sacrifice of being inoculated against smallpox with the genuine and life-threatening sacrifice of young Americans is just preposterous. And why the press reported that with a straight face and without cartoons just misses me altogether. Even I could write a cartoon about that.
But that's the way the political culture works. And in fact, a lot of this stuff could not take place if it wasn't for the very how well disciplined the political culture is. Both the press and also various intellectuals writing in scholarly journals. Who everybody sort of goes along with it, and no one asks the difficult questions. I mean, none of the arguments that are given for this war have any support for it whatsoever, and no evidence is ever given. And if we had a truly free press, and if we had an intellectual community that was doing the job it's supposed to be doing, this stuff would have been exposed in the first 24 hours. Because the whole thing is a fraud. There is not a single argument that is given for this war that has any evidence for it whatsoever. These people are going to go to war, and they don't care what excuse they have to come up with to do it. Because what they're really after, and I mentioned this before, is they want to once again set up a world system that's even greater than the world system they set up after World War II. You know, there's going to be no part of the world that's going to be left untouched, and that's what they're really after.
You know, sometimes cartoons have a lot to say. And here's Rumsfeld, and there's the little guy, the Texas cowboy, down below. And Rumsfeld says, "Come out, Saddam, you too, North Korea. We can take you all on at once. And all you terrorists, you too, China, and all you Palestinians, you, Santa Claus, make our day." This is kind of the mentality from the Dirty Harry movies, Clint Eastwood.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those were movies. This is reality.
But at least Dirty Harry went after people who could defend themselves. The basic principle is that you go after people who can't defend themselves. You know, there are countries that have nuclear weapons. I mean, India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, but the U.S. is not going after them. I think Howard Zinn, in his interview with Bill Moyers on Now last weekend, said there are essentially 8 countries that have nuclear weapons. There's actually, it turns out there's actually a UN resolution, I forget the number, that part of it has to do with eliminating weapons of mass destruction from the Middle East. But in order to do that, that means that Israel would have to give up its nuclear weapons. Now, the United States could not acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons because back in the 1970s, there was a congressional law that was passed that said that the U.S. cannot give any aid, any military aid to any country that has nuclear weapons. And so the way they play that game is that we just don't acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons.
Well, I think this opens up a conversation that I hope we'll have maybe another time because it is a big one. But I think it's the Bush administration's indifference to or ignoring, maybe it's strategically ignoring, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, which has deteriorated precipitously since Bush was elected. In the beginning, we were told that he didn't want to do anything that Clinton had done, and Clinton had worked his heart out for peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, and so Bush ignored that issue because that would be following what Clinton had done. But I do think that, and I think that Arab spokespersons from other nations besides Iraq will tell you that dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian question is one of the keys to unraveling our relationships with the Arab world. Until we address that, until we are active in requiring of both Israel and Palestinians some limitations, until we, for example, require Israel to bring the settlers back behind the 67 borders, I think there isn't going to be real negotiation, and it's my view, in the Middle East. And I think until that knot is unraveled, the Arab distrust of us and their antipathies toward the United States are not going to be resolved. And that Bush is on his tab because the last administration did bring the closest we've ever come to an agreement between those two. And of course, as somebody said about the Palestinians, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, but they did miss one there. And there are enormous gains to be made by this country's intervention in that problem. It is not unsolvable. And no less a person than the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia yesterday morning on an interview said as much. And he also said, unknowingly agreeing with The Guardian, that he had a strange feeling that there wasn't going to be a war. From his mouth.
I mean, well, I sort of agree with you, although I disagree with your formulation of it. What Clinton was working for was not a legitimate peace in the Middle East at all. And it's not true that Bush Jr. has kept his hands off the issue. He sided so totally with Israel on this. I mean, his efforts to demonize the Palestinians. I mean, there's always, down through the years.
Well, let's say he sided with Sharon, who is not the only Israeli, but
but
he's the prime
government,
minister. That's for
the
sure.
government and the Palestinian leadership has been demonized. I mean, this is a much too involved conversation to really get into with any detail. But I would simply say that it's not true that the Bush administration has kept their hands off this issue. They have gone at it completely in the wrong way. I mean, for years, the U.S. has always sort of secretly supported Israel while sort of rhetorically trying to remain neutral. But the real difference was that in Bush's case, it didn't even make any effort to remain neutral rhetorically. It was just very obvious, very supportive of Israel. But you're absolutely right about the fact that until that issue is resolved, there's not going to be any real peace in that neck of the
I think
woods.
I'm also right that Clinton worked very, very hard on the Camp David agreement, and that was, had they taken that would have been.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
You don't think he worked on
that? No, I think it was total. The entire Oslo Accords was a total capitulation on the part of the Palestinians to Israel. Total capitulation.
Well,
and it was Arafat's effort to basically save himself, because he was very close to being thrown out by his own people.
Right.
But as I say, this is a topic that's too involved to really get into in any depth. But I would simply say that I agree with you that until that issue is dealt with in a legitimate way, in which both parties are given satisfaction, not one over the other, then there's not going to really be any peace in
I agree. I agree.
Human lives are equal,
exactly right.
which we have to recognize.
Yeah.
But I would like to introduce here a slightly different perspective. And this is a statement that was made by a neurobiologist, a physician, an administrator in healthcare, a wonderful writer, an eloquent writer, and the name is Dr. Lewis Thomas, who died in 1993. But in his obituary notice, a most informative statement of his was included, and I think it's pertinent to our discussion to attend it. He was haunted. This man died in 1983, and the statement in the obituary notice, he was haunted in his later years by what he called the risk of earthly incandescence. It was unlikely, he believed, that the world would be done in by natural forces. Quote, "If we are to be destroyed, we will do it ourselves by warfare with thermonuclear weaponry," he wrote in his essay, Basic Science and the Pentagon. To him, the military's term, unacceptable damage, was itself unacceptable because, he wrote, it carries the implication that there is an acceptable degree of damage from thermonuclear bombs. Damage, he wrote, was also the wrong term, and words like disaster and catastrophe were too frivolous for the events that would follow a nuclear war. Individuals might survive, but survival is the wrong word, he said. There exists no medical technology that can cope with the certain outcome of just one small, neat, so-called tactical bomb exploded over a battlefield, he wrote. As for the problem raised by a single large bomb dropped on New York City or Moscow, with the dead and dying in the millions, what would medical technology be good for? As the saying goes, forget it. Think of something else. Get a computer running somewhere in a cave to estimate the likely numbers of the lucky dead.
Just a few weeks ago at Smith College, Helen Caldecott, the noted anti-nuclear proponent, gave a wonderful, wonderful talk. And she talks about the Holocaust and, thinking the unthinkable. But ironically, it is our country that has all the bombs, the superfluousness of them. But the nuclear war, killing. America has a preoccupation with murder. Watch television. We have 4 times the rate of murder in Europe. We have whole shows devoted to murder. CNN, the war in Iraq. And all of a sudden, war and other television shows become the same. Not real people. It's like children playing their deadly games. They're not killing real people, but somehow or other, I believe, their psyche is being damaged. We talk about not human beings, but collateral damage. And then the General Ashcroft, Attorney General, refers to the death penalty as the ultimate sanction. So I checked the dictionary for sanction, and it's defined as I read it: authoritative permission, countenance or support given to an action. Well, not in our name should we murder innocent Arabs. Not in our name should we give ultimate sanction to perhaps 10 million people who are not involved in this political thing. Innocent people who will be destroyed because of political gain. Before this happens, we must talk about it.
That's why we're here. Absolutely.
Well, no, go ahead.
No, I'm waiting.
Well, I just think that what the United States is doing is driving an arms race, because when you talk about weapons of mass destruction is the only action that other countries feel, that they can take, because who knows who the U.S. is going to go after next, And I think I mentioned in one of the earlier talks that even the war in Kosovo drove the arms race between India and Pakistan. Now the whole rest of the world feels that way. So if you're concerned about weapons of mass destruction, this coming war is going to make it much, much worse. Not to mention the fact that the people that are going to bear the brunt are, in fact, Saddam's victims. We're supposed to be so concerned about Saddam's victims, but Saddam's victims are actually going to die in this war. And we also haven't talked about the fact that this war could trigger a worldwide recession. At a time when the economies of the world are in pretty bad shape. Things could get an awful lot worse, as a result of it. There are, of course, people in this country that are going to make a killing on the war. The whole Pentagon system, which is basically, they talk about the military weapons and the military technology, but military technology is just a cover for high technology. It's basically, and our industrial system just has the military. The Pentagon system is just sort of a cover for it. So there are people who will make a killing on it, but for the most part, it's going to be a disaster for almost everyone in the world. And this business about the arms race is a very, very important aspect that we need to keep in mind here. That this is, we'd hope when the Cold War was over that suddenly the threat of a nuclear war would diminish, but the truth is that it's actually gotten worse, and it's not. A missile defense system is not going to help matters at all. In fact, it simply drives countries to be able to overcome it. And we've also talked in the past about the fact that the real threat is, somebody putting a nuclear weapon in a bale of marijuana and floating in the New York Harbor. I mean, that's the real threat. So you have all these different aspects that need to be taken into consideration. But I just have to come back finally to the fact that what they're really about here is terrifying the American public. And if the anti-war movement can overcome that, if we can break through that with information about how, there's just no reason for this war, then the war it can be stopped. If it starts, it could be stopped.
Richard, I don't want to interrupt you, but
Sure.
we are short of a few minutes, and we do have to conclude the program. And I would like to conclude it with some words from Howard Zinn. War always has unintended consequences. You start a war, you never know how it ends. Another point, by now we have reached a point in human history when the means of war have become so horrible that they exceed any possible good that can come out of using them. Since World War II, war has taken its toll increasingly against civilians. In World War I, there was a 10-to-1 ratio of military personnel killed versus civilians, whereas in World War II, that ratio got closer to 1-to-1. And after World War II, most of the people who have gotten killed in wars have been civilians. And by the way, I don't want to insist on the distinction, and this is something to think about, between innocent civilians and soldiers who are not innocent. The Iraqi soldiers whom we crushed with bulldozers toward the end of the Gulf War in 1991, in what way were they not innocent? In war, you kill the people who are the victims of the tyrant you claim to be fighting against. That's what you do. And wars are always wars against children. In every war, unforgivable numbers of children die. This brings me to the last general point I want to make. We ought to remind our neighbors, remind our friends, remind everybody we can that if we really believe that all people are created equal, we cannot go to war. If we really believe that the children of Iraq have as much a right to live as the children of the United States, then we cannot make war on Iraq. And if we're going to have globalization, let's have a globalization of human rights. Let's insist that we consider the lives of people in China and Afghanistan and Iraq and Israel and Palestine, that we consider the lives of all these people equal to one another, and therefore war cannot be tolerated. Those are his words, and I think I speak for all of us when I say humanity has to take priority over politics.
And peace is possible.
Thanks.
We should have a war or should not have a war. And we're going to borrow from Howard Zinn to provide some history and some facts. We believe in the sanctity of humanity. Abundance of information exists whereby to negotiate rather than to explode through military confrontation. We are a great nation for being sports-centered. But the truth of the matter is that human lives do not come in teams where we win, they lose. Children as young as 7 years old who have been interviewed by journalists have told them, war is no good. There are no winners. Everyone suffers. Killing militarily cannot produce the constructive connections nature has made possible for us. The capability of discourse, reason, logic, understanding. Leaders in government rarely endure the atrocities of the multitude of innocent civilians, women, children, other folk, none of whom are responsible for government's decision-making. Leaders tend to move on their own. Having been born in a country that a nation might hate, another nation might hate, is enough excuse for some countries to go to war. Those people somehow don't exist. War must be stopped. Ending segregation trained some people to take to the streets. Demanding the right to vote enlisted warriors. Ideologies, however, cannot stop wars. Only human beings can accomplish that goal. We understand human behavior may be shot through with unconscious motives, but why are we not creating a body of principles consciously motivating the principle, do not kill? We need a new world, but that can evolve only if we rearrange societal values to acknowledge all human lives as having the birthrights to share all the other human rights. And so we are initiating this program with an excerpt from the Village Voice that was printed December 25th, 31st, in which an interview took place with Howard Zinn. The article is entitled Peace Trainer, and I quote from that article: "The retired Boston University political science professor speaks out against war. He argues with the force of experience and history. Everywhere he looks these days, he sees possibilities for a strong popular movement against an invasion of Iraq. He sees hope in the college and high school students he speaks to, some of whom have read his best-selling revisionist history, A People's History of the United States, published first in 1980. And the numerous rallies and protests that are popping up in small towns from Montana to Alaska, not counting the larger events in cities like New York and Washington. These give him heart." Zinn also looks at the polls, which show welcome once again this January 14th, 2003, to another Talking Together program in the winter series 2000-2003. The quartet of four that you will see before you includes Walter Powers to my right, Mary Jane Gibson to his right, and Richard Sentner to her right. We understand that Bill Moyers hosted Howard Zinn on TV Friday evening, January 10th. We've decided that such exchanges take place not only on that television, but in other areas as well. And so today, we are going to share points of view about whether that as soon as questions of casualties or an extended campaign are raised, most of the country is opposed to war in Iraq. Quote from Howard, "There are large numbers of Americans whose support for war is easily punctured by facts, by new information." And so the four of us are hoping we can provide you with some facts and some information perhaps you haven't been able to attain.
I like the results of that poll, Ethel. Looking at the Cape Cod Times the other day, Bush retains powerful image. It seems that, but my question is, where is he leading us? And are we given a thoughtful, cogent rationale for his direction? And then again, another headline, Bush rallies nervous troops. President says war will be the last resort, but bolsters his case for combat against Iraq. And briefly, he says Iraq is a great threat to the United States, and Saddam Hussein has publicly proclaimed his hatred for our country. Saddam has used weapons of mass destruction, has defied UN resolutions that he disarm, and